بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا بارك في أوقاتنا ويغفر لنا ذنوبنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا يا مولانا. ونصلي ونسلم على الكريم وهو إمامنا وقدوتنا وحبيبنا الحمد كله لك يا الله تبارك وتعالى. نشكرك أن نكون في بيتك وأن ندرس كتاب مكتوب بالعالم ونطلب منك القبول له الإمام ابن رشد بداية المجتهد. فبارك في دروسنا وفي المذاكرة وفي المراجعة وافتح لنا أبواب الفهم. أما بعد. So we begin, inshallah. This is our first session, our introductory session to the study circle focused on Bidayat al-Mujtahid. It doesn't look like everyone is with us, but we will begin in any event. So we have some basic structure to organize ourselves here. And the syllabus was sent by way of the shared documents. And so the expectations here that are the students who have committed. And everyone else can benefit from the general lectures or the reflection, but here, this is for those who have committed to a more personalized, close study circle as far as the work development is concerned. Now, I wanted to make a point here that this is not entitled really a syllabus, because I wanted to move away from that idea of just following the university type structure. If you notice here, I noted that there is a study circle objective. That's because this is a study circle. And in a study circle, the idea of education is a lot different than in a course. In a study circle, there's more involved, although the university education is changing, but there's more involved. There's a teacher-student relationship, and there's the relationship among the students themselves. And also, there's the idea of actually studying a book head-on versus studying information that's presented to you in a facile way. It's a different type of work ethic as far as education is concerned. We're going to be using the book Bidayat al-Mujtahid, the translation. Unfortunately, the PDF is missing the introduction to Bidayat al-Mujtahid. And the PDF, we will have to come back to that point which the PDF missed out on, which is the introduction to Bidayat al-Mujtahid. But that's an introduction which is going to need a little bit of time to unlock, to unravel. And for our intent here, we say that the overall objective is to develop an understanding of scholarly methodology. Bidayat al-Mujtahid, it is a book that is noted as a book of comparative fiqh. But it's not a normal book in comparative fiqh in that, like Sheikh Ahmed al-Sabalik said, who was a teacher of mine who taught Bidayat al-Mujtahid and taught in specific a book that he wrote on comparative fiqh. He said that comparative fiqh is there to help us to learn how to gain refined manners and respect for others. So the idea of comparative fiqh, some have railed against it in the name of following just one school, a madhab. The idea of a madhab is that you have a system of studying the book and the sunnah, and some people say that there's four systems, four madhabs, and they limit it to that, which is the Hanafi madhab, the Maliki madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, and the Hanbali madhab. And so those are four systems of studying the book and the sunnah. So, one another, how do we make sense of that when the differences seem to be opposing differences? Or when the differences are even apparent differences, not core differences, right? Comparative fiqh teaches us how to understand what is a core difference, what is an apparent difference. And it teaches us to regard the other in the sense that we see that there's a process that they're using to achieve that position. It's not just an issue of opinion in the sense of what? In the sense of, I just do my thing and that's it. I have my opinion, you either with me or you're against me. No, there's a process that was achieved, right? There's a process that was followed up on. There's a process that was utilized to come to that position. And the beautiful thing in Islam, when it comes to the issue of following our desires, is that Islam stops that. And Islam says you can't come to a position for action unless you're sure that there's something that the deen is guiding you on. And so if you want to really come to understand that process, if you want to come to a position, right, then you have to make clear that there's a system, right, that you use. If you want to understand that process, then you have to be clear on that system. Let me clarify that point a little bit. It's not just the issue of saying something's halal haram like is the mainstay of majority of the Muslims in today's time. In order to achieve that knowledge of what is halal and haram, there's a process that we have to go through, and it involves using principles that pertain to how we deal with the Quran and the Sunnah and how we as the time progresses. So in other words, you don't just put an opinion out there, you have to show. It's like mathematics. You have to show the work. How did you get to that conclusion? And then that work can be checked. And that's the scholarly process, right, that we're looking at. How is it that scholars come to a conclusion on issues? So then what happens when you have groups of scholars working in an organized fashion, because they work in an organized fashion. And so you have one group here, one group here, one group here, one group here. Generally, we could say the madahib. And so they have to show their work of how they came to their conclusion. So when there's disagreement among them, and we're studying those disagreements, that's what we're doing with comparative fiqh. We're looking at those differences, and we're seeing how they came to their conclusions, the work. And sometimes it may be the case that we may say they're okay, right? It may be the case that we may say somebody's wrong here. But it's not us that says it, it's the ummah that says it, it's the body of ulama that says it, it's the people who are adept at this type of research and this type of thinking. And so Bidayat al-Mujtahid is one of those books that does that for us. Bidayat al-Mujtahid is one of those books that brings this thing together, this research, this thinking that we're talking about, it brings together in a systematic way. The student is expected then to kind of study the methodology. And in general, Imam Ibn Rushd is giving us a clear methodology, which we'll talk about. So the overall objective of this course, right? And I the brothers who were looking for a syllabus into this mindset so that they transfer from the idea of course to study circle is to develop an understanding of the manner in which the scholars approach Quran and Sunnah, to learn to develop a framework for thinking about the principles and methodologies that are used to understand evidences contained in the book and the Sunnah. And so along with that, we're going to see principles of Usul Fiqh. We're going to see how those are applied. Along with that, we'll see within that context, we'll see rules that pertain to the Arabic language, rules that pertain to hadith, and rules that pertain to identifying why it is that the ulama differ. A series of different rules that all of those things, when you bring those rules together, they constitute a methodology, or what some people would say today, a minhaj. When I use the term methodologies here in the plural, the reason why I used it in the plural is because Bidayat al-Mujtahid looks at the madahib. So you're going to see more than one way of approaching the issue of how a hadith is understood or an ayah is understood. We're going to learn what are usul principles. So a lot of people, they throw around the term, give me the dalil, give me the evidence, but they're not really sure as to what is the dalil or the evidence. If someone can do me a favor and put the link onto the, oh, hold on a second. Let me see if I can do that myself. So pardon for the interruption. So the concept of dalil in Usul al-Fiqh is not as the general people who say give dalil. It's not the same usage. It's not the same meaning. The concept of dalil or evidence that we use here is that plus more. In Usul al-Fiqh, dalil, most of the times it means what's the source of your knowledge, what is the reference. Understand that. Among the general people, dalil or evidence, it means what is the hadith that you're using in the general sense. Most of the time, they're not even referring to the Quran. And so the term dalil has to be understood in its proper context, that it has two meanings, it has two faces. The book that we're using, we already mentioned, is Bidayat al-Mujtahid. It was written by Imam ibn Rushd al-Maliki. Some of the ulama had some issues with him, given the fact that he was into philosophy and he had some positions that were controversial. Some of the ulama have, defended him, and in other words, not just throw him completely out of the fold of Islam. And they disagree with some positions he had. And the book is taught in Medina University for those who would try to bring up those type of controversy. That type of stuff was brought up in Egypt when I studied. When the Sheikh Ahmed al-Sabalik from the ulama of Azhar, Athari and Aqidah, when he brought up this issue of Bidayat al-Mujtahid as being a text to be studied, some of the brothers tried to contend the standing of Imam Ibn Rushd, losing therefore respect for the ulama, even if they have deficiencies, and not really having an understanding of how to deal with knowledge. A lot of younger people, they have that problem, that they don't know how to work with knowledge, and they're more hamasa, they're more emotional and enthused than anything, and it distorts the understanding. So we said that it was used in Medina, it was used in Kulliyat al-Da'wah, in the College of Dawah in Egypt. And part of that is to train people how to deal with differences of opinion, how to train people to break out of their understanding of how it is that Islamic scholarship proceeds. Imam Ibn Rushd is very systematic, very organized, very thoughtful, very principled in his approach in Bidayat al-Mujtahid. So we're going to be meeting every Sunday, inshallah, unless we agree to the opposite, from 12 to 1:30, or maybe a little more. We'll try to maybe take a little bit of a break. And our focus for right now will just be the book of Salah, the obligatory aspects. And each week we will designate the specific area focused from the book of Salah that we're studying. Remember, we're only studying right now the obligatory Salah. a chance to experience the whole concept of organizing and the whole concept of what it means to form a group is not easy. The purpose of that is because my methodology has been, even in teaching at Huda University, was to deviate from the traditional modality of what? The traditional modality of education. In the university system, what a lot of us are accustomed to, and to focus more on some of the ideas that are coming that are more innovative in education, not innovative in the sense of bid'ah, but innovative in the sense of creative and dynamic. And that's to have people uh, form in groups and do group work and teach each other. That's very Islamic. If you look at Imam Zarnuji, rahmatullahi alayhi, in Ta'lim wal Muta'allim, or Instruction of the Student, is a book on how to study that's used all over the Muslim world. It's a classic text. He talks about that there's an importance to have the time where the knowledge that one learns is reviewed in a group. And so one of the deficiencies that we have in today's time among the Muslim community is that people think it's just a student-teacher relationship. No, a lot of your learning is student-teacher and students, right? The students, they form in study circles, they review the knowledge, they research, they educate, and a lot of knowledge is gained like that and understanding. And so you will have people that will be more advanced than others, and they kind of move the group. And so you have the whole issue of the team, the small teams, and then you have the overall group. So you have two flavors there. One is you have a more intimate concept, and then you have the small group working concept. Because sometimes what happens when you have a big group and you assign things to the big group is that people get lazy, or people are not used to the concept. And so the small groups, you can control for that a little more, and then when you have a larger group but it's not too big, you can kind of control for that better. And that's something that's important in organizational thinking, to look at that issue of how to piggyback off of people's strengths. Right? When you start getting above 5 and 6 and 10 and this and that, it becomes extremely problematic, especially if you want to do things which require solidarity. There's some expectations, and one is that you're expected to discuss the material outside of the class. That's why you have the setup that you have, right, that we agreed to. One of the things is that you should make an effort to pre-read and keep reading, pre-read whatever section we're dealing with. We announce or we agreed to, but also keep just reading in the book of Salah overall. Imam Mukhtar al-Shanqiti, in his advice in teaching Zad al-Mustaqna, which is a Hanbali fiqh text, one of the things that he gave as far as his advice of how to study is, he said, first, you prepare for the class before the class. This is the student. And then you listen to the session, you participate in the session, and then you review afterwards. So in reality, you're looking at 3 stages, right? And so then there's some of that is done as individuals, and then you add the other stage of what you do together as a jama'ah, or if you do that as a jama'ah. And so then you will be adding on the layers of reflection and learning. That's important, to have that structure, to come to agree on how you're going to do that. Are you going to do that pre-reading as individuals? Are you going to do it together? Are you going to have any sessions together in that regard of reflection, or most of it is going to be done alone, and then the group is used for just a general discussion or inquiry? I'm not going to control all of that, right? That's something that you will have to learn how to deal with. I will guide it and see where you're at with that and see how you organize yourselves, right? But the more focus that you pay attention to how to organize yourself as far as studying is concerned, the more benefit that you will get in dealing with each other as a group, and also in reviewing the material. Although some people like to study on their own. But part of breaking from individuality and learning how to deal with groups is this type of work. And I've had a lot of experience experiences with this. In the few years that I taught with Al Huda, I implemented this with students, like 15 sometimes students, and it was very interesting to see how the Muslims lack internal organization, how the Muslims lack sometimes the ability to come together in this way. And so it's also kind of a tarbiyah, as they say, or formation process. There's some work that's demanded, knowledge work that's demanded, and that's that there's 2 3 page papers that will be due to complete the study circle and for you to be able to graduate out. One paper will be done as a group, as a whole, right? That means all of you have to cooperate towards contributing to that paper, and we have the tool of the Google Doc, which people can contribute. That's going to be a difficult task, but manageable and doable if you start working from now from the idea of how to organize yourself. And that brings a good dynamic. It really does. It's an awesome experience as far as I'm concerned. And then what you do with your team member, right? What you do with your team member. The topic right now, don't worry about that. And this is the grading criteria, how we grade ourselves, what we look for as far as quality work. That's all I'm concerned with, is the quality work and sincere attempts. We come up with the criteria. You come up with the criteria as a group, right? And so then it's focused on the material. It's not focused on some nebulous concept out there. I'm not testing for the unseen in your mind, or what you knew or what you heard or what you thought. You know what I'm saying? We're looking to see how we're developing, right? And in that sense, there's kind of following the contemporary school, the constructivist school. There is one exam, and that's why I tell you, keep reading the book of Salah. Learn the methodology of Ibn Rushd. I'll point it out so that when you take notes, and also we have the recording, the structure of Ibn Rushd's thinking will be with you. And that's what I'm looking for, to see if you understand that. Why? Because you're going to be able to apply this methodology, this structure, not only to Islamic discussions, but to discussions in general that don't pertain directly to the Quran and the Sunnah, but pertain indirectly and deal more with issues of community and deal with issues of intellect and so on and so forth. So the oral exam probably will be more challenging for some people. For others, no, because some people know how to communicate, and some people have to develop the communication skill. And so there's nothing, but you have to be able to demonstrate that you can articulate multiple times. But it's not a game. It's not a game. There has to be a commitment there. And it develops your oratory abilities, and it develops your ability to recall knowledge, to integrate knowledge, to synthesize, and to process it. So the general rules is that, as far as the decorum is concerned, that you respect and you support one another. Don't get nasty with one another. Don't violate the rules. Don't try, if there's sisters in the group, don't try to hit on the sisters. This is not a session for that. This is a session to focus. And so with that, if there's any questions, please type in. Can someone type in so that I can know that the chat is operational? So we see the Aliyah. Can everyone hear me? Can I get a verification on that? How's the transmission? Is it decent? This is one of the reasons why I opted to come to the masjid, to try to gain not only the barakah but also the receptivity. And so let's take like a 2-minute break. That's part of the issue. That's part of the issue that I have with the technology piece. For whatever reason, the service that I have in this area is not really functional. Uh, so let's take like a 2 minute break. It's 12:37. I'll leave the video on. We'll come back in 2 minutes, refreshing, and then we'll start with page 102 or 102 in the PDF. In the PDF, which is 96 in the book. So we'll come back in 2 minutes. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So wonder if everybody is back now, but we'll continue inshallah. So Imam Ibn Rushd, let me go to the Arabic. He's very systematic. And so in his approach to teaching and educating, usually he always gives an outline of what's coming. So the book is highly, highly structured. And it's important to have that anticipation in mind, because once you have that anticipation in mind that he's structuring stuff, you kind of begin to learn his system. Some of the ideas that I'm talking about are not necessarily there in the English, so we have to go to the Arabic. So he says that say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman. So he's beginning with the Basmala. The book of Salah begins with the Basmala. the norm of the ulama. Sometimes if you see a book that's written and it doesn't have the basmala, it may have the hamdala, which Allah tabarak wa ta'ala praised. And this goes back itself. It goes back to some hadith. The ulama dispute regarding the hadith that pertain to the basmala and the hamdulillah as far as beginning all of our affairs with them. But in any event, they practice that. So they begin their affairs with the basmala. Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah, he encouraged it greatly for all activities, especially the activities of knowledge, to be preceded with the basmala. And all our activities should have the dhikr of Allah. That helps us to transform ourselves, especially when we're going through a lot of issues in our iman. The coming together with the Muslims, in part, is the coming together to remember Allah. So the more that we keep that in mind in our interactions, in our circles, when we say Alhamdulillah, Astaghfirullah, that type of thing, that creates an environment of dhikr. But here, a work is initiated, so it's initiated not just as an academic work, but as a work of ibadah. And the evidence for that is that he begins with the basmala, so that there is a blessing that comes from Allah, or a barakah to gain acceptance from Allah. He sends salawat on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. After all, the book of Salah is a study of the Prophet. What we're studying now is studying the Prophet. We're studying the Prophet's worship, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how he worshipped Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. And so that's a great blessing in and of itself in that regard. It's a systematic study of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the angle not necessarily of emotion, but from the angle of devotion, right? In devotion, not in the sense of just sending salawat on him, like in that sense, no, from devotion in the sense of how he worshipped Allah. So he says the salatu تنقسم أولا بالجملة إلى فرض وندب. So then he says والقول المهيد بأصول هذه العبادة ينحصر بالجملة في أربعة أجناس، يعني أربع جمل. الجملة الوجوب وما يتعلق به، والجملة الثانية صفة شروطها الثالثة، يعني شروط الوجوب وشروط الصحة والشروط التمام والكمال. والجملة الثالثة في معرفة ما تشتمل عليه من أفعال وأقوال وهي الأركان. والجملة الرابعة في قضائها ومعرفة إصلاح ما يقع فيها من الخلل وجبره، لأنه قضاء ما إذا كان استدركه لما فات. So it's a mouthful. So here the Shaykh is saying that, look, Salah is broken up into two types as far as a ruling category. That which is obligatory, that which is fard, and that which is mandub. And the term mandub here will include all of the sunnah, right? And so what's encouraged that he gained from Aristotelian philosophy was this: Aristotle had this concept that was scientific, and he brought it into philosophy. And one of it, the benefits of it is to categorize things. There's a negativity in that. I have my own theories on the idea of racism in the Western world, and I think in part that comes from that Greek concept of categorizing out people, and putting hierarchical categories out. That's a thinking that I have, and making mistakes in generals in particular. But that's another issue. But for our intents and purposes, in the university system, when we start categorizing, like words, and then we start talking about nouns, and then you start talking about what type of nouns and verbs and what type of verbs, that system of categorization comes from this type of thinking. So he categorizes the salah in that regard into that which is obligatory and that which is recommended. The fard, how do we know that it's obligatory? In general, the fard, we'll go into it with more detail, but the fard is uh, known by the language that we find in the Quran and the Sunnah in general. So when we talk about placing one of the five values, whether something is an obligation, whether something is a prohibition, whether something is wajib or fard, to mean the same thing for our intents and purposes. The Hanafis have a different understanding, but we're not going to get into that right now. So if something is fard or wajib, or if something is haram on the opposite extreme, if something is mandub or sunnah or mustahab, recommended in general, the nadib, or if something is mubah, permissible, or if something is disliked, makruh, all of that, how do we gain an understanding of how do we apply those values to action? Remember that fiqh is about looking at actions, and giving action one of these values. Is prohibited, is an obligation, is recommended. All of that comes from the language for the most part. And so with the issue of salah, it breaks up into two categories from the angle of the values, from the angle of responsibility. We're responsible to perform this action. But responsible in what way? As an obligation. Responsible in what way? As a recommendation. Imam al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi alayhi, Sheikh Arsalan Haq from Texas, he says something that was very strong with regard to the sunnah, that the abandonment of the sunnah is either hidden kufr, some issue that someone has, right? And so that the sunnah are the stairwell supports to Allah Ta'ala. We ask Allah Ta'ala, and here what we mean by sunnah is those acts which are what? Are recommended. All of this is from the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, an act that's obligatory, an act that's recommended. But the term sunnah, as you will come to see with more detail, in fiqh, it means that which is recommended, right? As opposed to just thinking about sunnah from the usuli angle, the source of knowledge, the sunnah, the way of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The ulama, a lot of times they're using sunnah to indicate in fiqh, to indicate that it's not an obligation. It's not of the same tier of responsibility. But that doesn't mean that we abandon it. And so this part that I'm reading now, it can be found in the introduction of the book of Salah. Prayer is divided initially as a whole into two kinds, obligatory and recommended. Shoot the question. The discussion covering the principles of this form of worship is confined to four categories. That is, four parts. Part one is about the identification of the obligation, right? To identify what's an obligation and what's related to that. Well, I'm waiting for the question. Part two is about the identification of conditions which pertain to the obligation. We have to sit with this. It's not easy to understand. From my understanding, from my limited understanding of what Imam Ghazali said, this pertains to not being content with with the deen itself. In other words, none of the ulama in the past, as today, these debates that happen now, the way that they happen now. Remember that deen was practiced, it was a way of life, it was understood. We're the ones that have the issue because we don't prize knowledge. We, as a community, we don't prize creating communities of practice in a real sense. So there was heavy penalty. Forgive us. But something like witr, like missing the witr salah, your testimony would be rejected. So Imam al-Ghazali, and it needs more context, it doesn't appear that he's talking about just kufr and ni'mah, ingratitude. And it's basically saying not necessarily that we're outside of the deen, but saying that those qualities of kufr that we know as unbelief, how do we move towards a more complete community? And then sometimes what happens is that we lose that momentum because the lifestyle is not there. And so those ulama, in that regard, they were very sensitive to things of the deen, especially acts of ibadah. That's why they have value, right, in studying, because they're models in that regard of practice. They're models of practice. They're models of exemplifying the sunnah. And so here it says part one. It says القول المحيط, a statement which is going to is all encompassing, right? I should say, or encompassing, is going to be presented with regard to the principles or the usul of these ibadah or acts of ibadah, right? That come into the salah, the book of salah. And so then there's 4 categorizations or genus types, right? In the of knowledge here. One is that we should, is knowledge of what's obligatory upon us, and what's related to the obligation, right? And I'm now going back to the Arabic versus just sticking to the translation. The other type of knowledge, right, is to know the 3 conditions that come back to Salah, or the 3 types of conditions, right? And I should say ibadah in general, so I can stay in line with Ibn Rushd. Let me return back to that. And we're going to present an encompassing statement with regard to the principles which govern this ibadah, or these acts of worship. And they are contained into 4 overall types of knowledge. The first type of knowledge is going to pertain to knowing the obligation and what relates to the obligation, right, when it comes to worship. The second type of knowledge is to become familiar with 3 conditions that are used to categorize ibadah. The first type of condition is the conditions which pertain to obligation. The second type of obligation, and the second type of condition is the conditions which pertain to the soundness of the act of ibadah, and how we know if it's completed, how we know if it's perfected. And the third type of condition is what pertains to actions and speech or statements. Like in the Salah, we have actions and we have statements. Part of the statement is like when we go into ruku', we make a dhikr. Or we go into sujood, we make a dhikr. That's part of the statements. Or when we transition from one position to another, we make a dhikr. That's part of the words or the statements. And then, so for instance, in the act of salah, we have the standing, we have the bowing, we have the prostration. So all of those positions have names in their actions. So we're going to be looking at categorization of knowledge from that angle, of that knowledge which looks at the actions and statements. Knowledge that looks at actions and statements in the act of ibadah itself. And he says that these, وَهِيَ الْأَرْكَانِ, these are the pillars of the salah. The pillars of the salah. It comes back to the pillars of the salah. Then we have another fourth category, and that pertains to once you know the obligation, once you know the soundness of the action, if it's sound or not, once you know what acts you should do and what things you should say, then there's the issue, the fourth type of knowledge which you have to know with pertaining to salah, or with relation to salah, which is how to make up. There's some differences here between the translation and the, which is interesting. I never noted that before. Here is making up the salah. He called it delayed performance, but it's making up the salah in part. The fourth type of knowledge is making up the salah when there's a deficiency in it. Not just the issue of delaying the salah because you have an excuse. And so, in general, those are the four categorizations of knowledge that we're going to be dealing with in the book of Salah. Are there any questions so far? Then what comes next now is more details. He's going to Ibn Rushd, he presents the knowledge in a succinct way, and then he takes the points that he mentioned in details. And so the organization of the book flows. What's the Fiqh question? The first type of knowledge is knowledge which pertains to the obligation that pertain to the act of ibadah, the salah itself. The third type of knowledge is that knowledge which pertains to what it constitutes the actions and the statements or the sayings or the speech which are part of the salah. And then the Shaykh says, and these are the arkan or the pillars. There's some things we have to say, some things we have to do. So in the salah is initiated with takbiratul ihram. Some say takbiratul tahrim. Basically, it just means that first takbir that initiates the salah makes prohibited to us any other action. The only action that's permissible for us in salah, once that takbirat al-ihram or tahrim is initiated, is what we're commanded to. And even at the spiritual level, that's why we have to be focused. The mind has to be focused. So the first action, Allahu Akbar, you hear that? And that's how you know that the salah was initiated. Either you will hear the Quran recited, or you will not hear the Quran recited, because the recitation of the Quran, as far as listening to it in the salah, hearing it, or as far as reciting to yourself, that pertains to the whole idea that the salah is those salawat which are recited out loud. There's two categories of salah, and this is, and those salawat which are recited in silence. And the two salawat, Zuhr and Asr, are two prayers which are prayed in silence as far as the Quran is concerned. But as far as the structure of the salah, you hear the first takbir, Allahu Akbar. Then you recite to yourself. If you're in the jama'ah, everyone is reciting to themselves. Once the recitation is finished on the part of the imam, he says Allahu Akbar. He goes into bowing or ruku'. And then once he finishes making the dhikr that's legislated for that action, the act of ruku', it has certain statements that are made. So the act of ruku' has a statement that's associated with it. Once that's finished, another statement is made. Sami Allahu liman hamida. And then we respond either in silence or in a low tone, Rabbana wa lakal hamd. And then now we're preparing ourselves to go into sujood after having come up. We say after we came up from ruku', Sami Allahu liman hamida, Rabbana wa lakal hamd. So we stand there now, we're in qiyam, and then we're getting ready to go into what? Prostration. What stated? Remember that we said that the third type of knowledge is knowing what is to be done, what action is to be performed, and what statement is to be made. So the statements of the imam serve as an alert system for us to know where we're at in the salah, even if we don't see him. That's why it becomes an issue of the masjid having the proper organization. Sometimes there's debates with regard to the role or place of women in the salat line, and that comes up later. That comes up, but I want you to look that up. The place of the woman in the congregational salah. And so if she's not in the same room with the brothers in the back, and that has its own evidences, I'm not going to get into the discussion because this is not the time for it, because some of those who came liberal in their approach to that, they're negating as far as those are hadith that pertain to the salah of the jama'ah, and they want to collapse the differences between males and females in that regard. We can have a separate discussion there. If you came to the masjid, you build on what you are certain on. So, again, if it's a salah that's prayed out loud, it's easier to know where the imam is at. Because if he's reciting, that means you're in the first part of the salah, if you can hear the recitation. If he's not reciting, that means you're in the second part of the salah. So that's going to either be maghrib or right, or it's either going to be fajr. But in the most difficult thing is just to determine if you made the rak'ah or you didn't make the rak'ah. And again, you have to get used to the statements that are made, and you can determine in the salah, should say better. But we can talk about that with more detail. It'll become clear, I hope. So he says that in this part, there are 4 issues in identifying the obligation. Remember that we said there's 4 types of knowledge that we're going to be dealing with. And the first, في معرفة الوجوب وما يتعلق به. And for is we're looking for the knowledge of what is and what pertains to that obligation. So here in this section, he says in this part, there are 4 issues that are taken to be principles of this topic. The first issue is about the exposition of its obligation. In other words, coming to know the obligation. Right? The second issue is about the number of its, basically how many times does this obligation take place. The third issue is about the individual, right, who's responsible for that obligation. The fourth issue is about the consequential obligation. In other words, the consequence of intentionally not performing the obligation. Right? There needs to be a little bit of a reformation of the translation. But alhamdulillah, may Allah bless Dr. Imran Niazi. So this here now, how do we know something is an obligation in this case? How do we know that the salah is an obligation? This is the usuli point. This is where you start to see usuli fiqh apply. How do we know salah is an obligation? We all hear that salah is an obligation, but how do we know that it's an obligation? What are the sources of knowledge which determine that salah is an obligation? The first is the book, the Quran, as a source of knowledge. We're not looking at a detailed ayat which is saying establish the salah, but we're saying in general the source of knowledge, the first referent is the Quran as a source. The other source of referent is the Sunnah. And the other evidence, here the book and the Sunnah are both sources and evidences. Consensus is not an evidence by itself. And there's 2 types of evidences. General evidences, which really means principles. And then there's detailed evidence, which really means a specific ayat of the Quran or hadith. So here, how is the obligation established? What are the sources of knowledge for us in that regard? We refer to the book, we refer to the Sunnah, we refer to consensus. Consensus means that there's an agreement that does not allow for division. It's a matter that's agreed upon and it never is discussed again. No one can come and change that. And so once that agreement takes place in such a way that is considered an infallible position. You can't use the term consensus so lightly because not everything is going to get that type of standing. But the consensus of the ummah is the only time that we have a manifestation of human beings being infallible outside of the prophets. Infallibility, meaning that you can't be wrong, only takes place, we only see infallibility among the general people, us as an ummah as a whole, even if you have scholars. General people meaning as opposed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as opposed to the Prophet or the Prophets alayhi salam. When the ummah comes together, is major knowledge representatives, when they come together and they come to an agreement, and there's no one person dividing, 2 people dividing, there's a solid agreement, that's what we call an ijma' or consensus. That decision is an infallible decision, is the power of the ummah to come to a conclusion on something, and once that conclusion is reached by the ummah, in that regard by its representatives, then it's infallible. There's no doubt in it. There's no blaming. That doesn't happen all the time. So in the issue of salah, you can't be a believer and go against these proofs. This obligation of the salah is established by the Quran, by the Sunnah, by the consensus of the ummah. And he says the fact that it is so widely known makes his discussion unnecessary. معلوم من الدين بالضرورة, known by necessity, that the average person knows. If that person has a little bit of knowledge, ayah of the Quran is listed in the first page of the book of Salah. Page of the book of the Salah, it's the book, the Sunnah, and consensus. So, and also the principle that is known is knowledge that's known regarding the deen by necessity. That's a principle that's used by the scholars. Let's take a break here. I'm gonna shut down the video. I don't know if it's going to record the way that I would like it to, but we're going to shut down the video. That way we give the streaming a break and refreshing, and so that it's easier to deal with and it's easier to upload. So we'll be back. Let's do like about let's do like a 5 minute break. We can go to like about one, then we can stop at 1:30. So let's break right now.